Thank you, everyone. Before we get started, can we all just give a real round of applause for the League of Women Voters? The League is not only responsible for today's event, but for a century of progress and advocacy. Thank you so, so much. I, in my line of work, am blessed to be in the democracy business. And today is a great day for democracy in Minnesota. 100 years ago, the Minnesota legislature, right here, became the 15th state to ratify the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution. It was a huge victory for voting rights. My grandmother, who was born in 1902, always remembered voting here in Minnesota in her first presidential election after ratification of the amendment. She got to do something that her immigrant mother had never done before, either in Eastern Europe from which she had fled, or here in America. She got to vote, which meant that she got a voice. She felt proud, empowered, and fully American. Although the 19th Amendment did not enfranchise all women, it made those within its reach, like my grandmother, feel included and respected. The newspaper coverage at the time captured the joy of the moment for so many who had worked for so long to get the right to vote. Here is the lead of the Minneapolis Morning Tribune the next day. Quote, Minnesota women suffragists celebrated yesterday the ratification by the Minnesota legislature of the federal suffrage amendment by which they are to be created voters equal with men. The article went on, quote, and in the Jubilee banquet, they laid definite plans for their entrance into full citizenship, resolving to accept in full their new responsibilities and to work side by side with the men for the highest ideals of Americanism. Yesterday was the greatest day in the long history of women's suffrage in Minnesota, they agreed. It is not the end, however, it is the commencement, end quote. And how true that was. What happened 100 years ago, right in this building, was not the end, it was the beginning. And we all have a responsibility not just to vote, but to get others to use their right to vote as well. So that is our shared mission. And as Secretary of State, I know that I stand on the shoulder of giants who came before me, who opened doors and pushed boundaries in the name of voting rights. So it is my special honor to introduce to you one of those giants who will share her reflections about the progress we've made and the progress yet to come. Please join me in welcoming the Honorable Joan Anderson Growe, who served as Minnesota Secretary of State from 1975 to 1999, a pioneer and a major figure in the history of the state of Minnesota.
Thank you, Steve, and thanks to the League of Women Voters for organizing this for all of us. You know, when I was in office, I had a photo on my wall that showed 2 or 3 women suffragettes sitting at a long table with a banner over their head, and I thought I saw that banner here for a moment today. But the banner said, and this probably was in 1917 or 1918, and the banner read, Minnesota denies the right to vote to criminals, lunatics, idiots, and women. Is this chivalry? And so the movement really started long ago, back in the late 1700s, when Abigail Adams wrote to her husband John, and I'm going to quote this because it's one of my favorite quotes. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could, if particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies. We are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. And the suffragettes really did that. It's been a long, long many ways. My interest in voting rights and accessibility started when I was a young mother of 4 children living in Burnsville. I needed some intellectual stimulation, so I joined the League of Women Voters. Well, I was assigned to the job of being voter service chair. I thought, what is that? And it was only then, when I studied those issues, that I thought about the fact that to register to vote in those days meant that you had to go to City Hall in person when the office hours were there and open. Well, my committee got together and we thought, well, that should change. This is a growing community, people coming in and out, people commuting to work. So we went down and met with the city clerk and got him to agree that League of Women Voters could be temporary deputy registers. So we had a big formal ceremony. We were all sworn in to uphold, I suppose, the city council rules in Burnsville. And then we took our new designation to absolutely every PTA meeting that was held that fall, where we sat and registered voters for the entire evening. And I will tell you, people were so grateful. And our plan was so unusual and so unorthodox for that day and age that we made the newspaper. And we thought, yes, more publicity. Well, that image and that feeling has stayed with me all these years. And by the way, so has the League, which I joined wherever I lived. But having been involved with election law changes, major changes, when I served in the legislature, you can imagine how excited I was to be elected Secretary of State, and now I was going to be in charge of elections for the entire state of Minnesota. My first hire was a former League of Women Voters president. We promoted and lived by the philosophy that voting is a right, and election administrators are obligated to assist folks to fulfill that right. It is not, as some people say, a privilege to be granted. I had the opportunity to implement election day registration, absentee voter registration, and then through the years, special rules for college students, motor voter. We introduced the bill to allow absentee voting with no reason. It took 30 years to pass, and I think Steve finally managed to get it passed just a year ago. And I think all of us in this room have contributed to our civic engagement and to promoting democracy. And I think we should be very proud that in the last 8 of the last 9 elections, Minnesota has had the highest turnout in the nation. It is a record we can all be proud of. And I am so proud and so grateful for having had the opportunity to help change the climate around voting. And for that, I thank Minnesotans and thank you to the League of Women Voters. Thank you.
And now it is my pleasure to make another very special introduction. Gwen Walz is Minnesota's 39th First Lady. As a lifelong Minnesotan, she's excited to work on behalf of all Minnesotans. Throughout her life, Gwen has been working passionately to build a more just and equitable world, involving herself in many issues that are timely right now. But throughout it all, her desire to learn from and work with others to advance meaningful change is her guiding principle. And I know over the last 8 months, she's not only been very busy, but very involved, very passionate, and very effective. She has been a true leader. It's my honor to introduce our First Lady, Gwen Walz.
We
celebrate together. I'd just like to first thank Joan Growe. I just can't imagine that in my wildest dreams I'm speaking after Joan Growe. Being a real Minnesotan growing up in the 70s and 80s and 90s in Minnesota, we looked at her as if she were the rock star because she was right there in the midst of things and always so poised and confident and stood her ground. She just knew who she was. That meant a great deal to women of my generation. And I think we can never thank you enough, so I'm just in awe. Join you also, and he would have said it's a little bit of a history lesson today about what we call the women's suffrage movement, and we're here to honor the women and some of the men who made that all possible. I think of this year, and my grandmother in just next 1 week is celebrating her 100th birthday. So she was born, right, 100 years ago in the month of September. And then I think about my daughter Hope, who's here today with us also, who's a freshman at the University of Minnesota. And I think about the range of opportunity for women and the way we see ourselves because of the right to have the vote. I'd like to just take a minute and introduce my daughter who came from the university today to be here and to be part of this rally. Her name is Hope. She's right over there. And not only that, Joan Growe and the League of Women Voters, she brought her roommate with her, Katie, and a friend, Caitlin, right there. And my nephew, also a freshman at the university, because we need a few good men, Peyton, and his friend Andrew, and his roommate Max. So, right? Beginnings and endings. So I'm going to make it rather brief because we do have homework to do this afternoon, completing our first week at the U. I'd like to share some of the governor's proclamation for this historic day. It outlines many things and it's more wordy than I would be, and I'll hand it over in just a moment. But he says, whereas in 1848 at the Women's Right Convention in Seneca Falls, New York, the Declaration of Sentiments launched the women's suffrage movement, declaring, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Whereas Minnesota suffragists, many of whom are now recognized on the Minnesota Women's Suffrage Memorial, worked together over the span of 72 years to educate, to rally, and advocate for a women's right to vote and to be elected to public office. Founding organizations such as the Minnesota Women's Suffrage Association in 1881, the Scandinavian Women's Suffrage Association in 1907, and the Every Woman Suffrage Club in 1914. There's more, I'm just going to skip ahead. Whereas on September 8th, 1919, the Minnesota legislature, through a joint resolution, became the 15th state to ratify the 19th Amendment. In an extraordinary session convened at the state capitol in St. Paul at 12 o'clock noon, with a vote in the Senate of 60 yeas to 5 nays, and the House of Representatives 120 yeas to 6 nays. Whereas to the self-sacrifice and persistence of women suffragists, the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution became the law of the land on August 26, 1920, forever changing the political landscape and opening up a new century of voting rights and civic engagement across our country and the great state of Minnesota. Governor Tim Walz declares September 8th, 2019 as the Minnesota Women's Suffrage Day. For all continues, just as it did that day. We are beginnings, we are endings. It is today a day of an absolute celebration of this milestone, but it is a beginning in our fight to ensure that every American still can cast their ballot. I echo the suffragist sentiments and recognize the fight to secure and defend voting rights. It has not ended, it continues. Again, today we celebrate, but we must also pledge and make our commitment as women, as citizens, as Minnesotans to the right to vote.